We have just an incredible time here. We're going to hear from Dr. Waybright, Dr. Gyertson, and Dr. Sims. They're each going to share briefly, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. So as they discuss, I want you to be thinking of some questions, and then we'll be recording this, so don't pop your hand up in the middle of the discussion, but go ahead and save those for the end, and then we'd love to welcome your questions and have a brief discussion time. So without further ado, let's welcome our three speakers.
Thank you very much. Our hope in this time is that this is really more for you. And so as Andrew just said, whatever questions you have, comments, reflections from our time together throughout the entire week, but especially in light of some of the things we're going to share in the next few minutes, what we've decided to do is each of the three of us are going to share for just a few minutes each, and then we're going to save the rest of the time for Q&A and conversation with all of you. And so that's our hope in these next few minutes, to make this about your primary questions. And so I'm going to hand it off to Greg, let him share for just a moment. We'll just kind of go around the circle, and then we'll begin some dialogue.
All right. Well, good afternoon. And I see that only the most spiritual ones sit on the front row. I see, just like my church. That means I don't ever have anybody up there so much. So if we're going to share briefly about this, which we'll really try to do, I thought that the best thing that I might say in a preach it, lead it, sort of a time together, is the role that I see preaching play in light of today's chapel in a church like ours that once was very homogeneous. I mean, well-educated, affluent, sort of a community, into actually being one that looks more like the all of thems and the Jesus is all of thems. And the thing I want to say is I think preaching has a central role to play in furthering what I think the church is supposed to be within its community, but it can't do everything. It has a role to play, but it can't do everything. So I jotted down a couple of the things that I think it can do. One, I really find that in preaching, you have a great opportunity to communicate the biblical vision of what God is doing. You can tell even by the way I've done the sermons here. It can communicate what's doing, and it can communicate God's vision of what His people should be within the community. What it really cannot do is facilitate the kinds of interaction and relationships that deal with the thing that lead to our brokenness across the lines of, the racial divides, the generational divides. So that in a church like ours, where we have a good number of African American people, but also those who are white, in this past year when we had all the black and blue challenges of violence, where police were involved in the deaths of many young African American men. I'm fishing for the language here. We had two of those happen in Pasadena. And our church that had both black and blue, and what I say blue who wear black, police who... Preaching can share the vision that we need to be one community in Christ in the divided world, but it cannot. Preaching is not going to help you work through some of the challenges that are there. That's the first thing I wanted to say. I think second, preaching can set the stage for your church community actually to change. If it's always been one way, reaching one group of people, you can begin to communicate that this notion of a people in a divided world that demonstrate the glory of God through our unity. I mean, the book of Ephesians is where I see all of that. You have a triune God who's one, the church where they couldn't get along, Jew and Gentile. So preaching can communicate, set the stage for change. And in that, saying, if we're going to become more than we've been before, then we just have to be a much more friendly and welcoming group. And we have to be the ones who extend ourselves to invite people out to lunch. So you can set the stage for it, but you can't actually do it. And then the third thing that I thought that I'd mention to you is that I think preaching can also demonstrate the values of a much more diverse kind of a community. What do I mean by that? It means that in the preaching you can recognize through the illustrations that you use, through the applications that you use, that you also actually recognize that a whole new group of people are there who weren't there before. So that if you've been only an older church and you want to reach a younger church, you need to be able to find some illustrations and applications that actually speak into the world of those younger adults that you may want to reach. In our own church, we have an ever-growing, what I call it a Pan-Asian community, all the way from China across to India. It's David, who has been a part of our church, has seen that that's been a part of the demographic of the San Gabriel Valley where we're located, and it's becoming very much a part of our own church. It's actually, when you think about it, our Father is drawing to himself in huge numbers people from China and really all across parts of Asia, and we're just getting the blessing of being able to have some of the fruit of that come into our church. So for us then to recognize that our Chinese people are there are all sorts of things that we do, and even for me in the preaching, I can talk about it if we want to talk about it. Family life is different in the Asian family in general from the nuclear family, individualistic family in my own, culture. And so I have to learn how to preach to family in a different way. They celebrate different traditions so that, New Year is even bigger than Christmas or anything in the among those many in China and outside of China, the Lunar New Year. We celebrate that in our church. So, but we have to sanctify it, because kind of like our Christmas and Easter holidays, it's a lot of paganism that's crept into that thing. But there are many things there that we can do, and our applications need to be. And the last thing I'll just say is, what that's meant for me as a pastor is I didn't know what illustrations to use. And I didn't know what, and I still don't fully know. I still feel like I'm a novice. I didn't know what applications to bring. But that's where you need to be able to enter in and learn from your people. It takes a measure of humility, doesn't it, to say, I'm so thankful that you're here. I don't quite know how this word fully applies to you, but let's talk about and keep learning. And that's been a big part, even in joining together, collaborating across those divides before I preach the sermons, to do that. What I do find, and I just want to give you the assurance of this, I find that when you and I do that hard biblical work that you learn to do in seminary, and you communicate what that word says, it speaks across the cultures. It speaks into the needs of all people. It's just that we as the preachers have to be that bridge between the worlds. And so those are the things I thought I'd say.
Good. One of my most memorable experiences in sitting in Greg's congregation was the Sunday he came in a dragon costume. No, I'm just kidding you. Just kidding. Really trying to be relevant here.
I was hoping you'd forget that.
I forgot that, that's right. Greg's talked about preaching. Let me pick up on the leadership side of things. And those of you that were in my session yesterday know that I've been soaking, along with a colleague of mine, one of Dr. Sims' former professors at Regent, Dr. Corné Becker from South Africa. Several years ago, we were getting a lot of questions about what does it really mean to lead like Jesus leads? What does that really mean? Because we were sensing, in terms of the leadership instruction we were doing both in the PhD program in organizational leadership as well as the Doctor of Strategic Leadership degrees at Regent, that there was a dissonance, a disconnect between most of what was in contemporary Christian leadership literature and what we saw in the model of Jesus Christ, because so often, people say they want to lead like Jesus led. So Dr. Becker and I ended up then spending a great deal of time together in Philippians chapter 2. If you know that chapter, you know it's the kenotic hymn, the kenosis, where Jesus empties himself out of privilege in order to, not of essence, but out of his privilege, in order to relate effectively to the people. And as we began to really soak in and exegete the various components of Philippians 2, it became clearer and clearer to us that it was a point of view problem. I spent several years in broadcasting, and one of the things that you'll see on the notes in the control room are the initials POV. What's the point of view for this particular scene? What is it you want the audience to see, to look at? And so because Regent University was founded in a broadcast communications context with the Christian Broadcasting Network, that began to resonate with us in terms of what's the POV of leading like Jesus leads. And the POV in Philippians 2 is very, very different than the POV in most secular Christian leadership or secular leadership literature, as well as in Christian leadership literature. And that POV is that the camera is focused on the led, not the leader. So much of what we see in contemporary leadership literature, training, equipping, all of the various strength finders, on and on you go, essentially the whole emphasis is on the leader. But if we're going to lead like Jesus led, taking this concept in Philippians 2 that he, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon himself the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of man. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. And so to lead like Jesus leads means that the focus is on those that we're called to lead. And that our challenge as leaders is to figure out, in the Lake Avenue kind of congregation, how do you lead various congregations within congregations? How do you become for them the kind of leader that then relates to their context like Jesus chose to relate to us? Now, as we said, it's very important theologically that we understand that kenosis doesn't mean that he emptied himself out of his essence. What he did was he was willing to empty himself out of his privilege. And so that his whole concept was, if I have to give up my crown, if I have to give up my throne, if I have to, in order to identify with those that God has given me to lead, to come down and be the lowliest of the low, to connect with the most despised culture group, to be the poorest among the most despised culture group, to be born in the poorest of conditions, to be raised in the poorest of cities. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? You know, it's that kind of contextualization that really caused Dr. Becker and I to have a whole different view. And not that there isn't a place for leadership development and training that focuses on our strengths, that focuses on who God has equipped us to be, the talents he's given us, the predispositions that he's given us, but that those may have to be, and I would say based on my experience, often have to be put aside. What I would prefer, my preference, my leadership style in this situation, that is my natural predisposition, in some situations is just the wrong way to lead in this particular model. And so the challenge I think we have as we're called into leadership is to look at the POV. What's the point of view here? And it's all about those that we're called to minister to. So frequently in Scripture, there's this fundamental construct that before Jesus did anything, before he preached, before he healed, before he delivered, you have this underpinning that he, having compassion on them, which means, where was he looking? He was looking deep into the depths of the needs of the people. He, having compassion on them, healed them, preached to them, delivered them, confronted them, because he had their greatest concern, and whatever was necessary for him to sacrifice was necessary. The other point here, as Dr. Becker and I kind of wrestled with the rather troubling implications of saying we want to lead like Jesus leads or led, based on Philippians 2, is the idea that often suffering has to be a part of that. Philippians 3:10, that, oh, that I might know him in the power of his resurrection. Well, so much leadership theory is based around power and influence, but it goes on to say, and also in the fellowship of his sufferings. And then we began to look at scriptures like that his strength is made perfect in our weakness, that we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that the excellency of the power might be of him and not of us. That when the vessel cracks, it's the beautiful opportunity for what's truly inside to kind of ooze through the cracks and be magnified against the earthen vessel. In one of my assignments, I worked for a very successful, world-renowned leader, and I was troubled at times by his feet of clay. And one of his lieutenants, closest to him, caught my troubled reactions when his earthenness would appear. And he said, David, what you need to understand is that all of God's prophets are just a little mad. You know, they're just a little screwy. They have feet of clay. And the reason that God selects often scarred people, cracked pots, you know,
Cracked pots.
that's right, and people with feet of clay is so that when the glory is ultimately manifested, it is so clear. And he said, the longer you work with this gentleman, the more you will realize it's got to be God, because it can't be him in terms of what's happening. So I think that what we're trying to think about, and within our Wesleyan tradition, the whole ideas of humility, the whole ideas of humbling ourselves, being willing to lay aside our privileges, really is one of the things that is the fruit of the sanctified heart. That, you know, our conveyance, the conveyance of our leadership in terms of our leadership cart has two wheels. It has the Great Commission, which essentially is what we're supposed to be doing, go and teach. But that is also balanced on the other side of the cart with the Great Commandment, that we go and teach, loving the Lord our God with all of our soul, heart, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourself. And it's in the Great Commandment embracing that has been a part of, I think, historical Wesleyan thought, which is really a recovery of New Testament understanding, that in the end it's not the what, when, where, and how of leadership that really makes the difference in terms of God's impact, but it's the who and the why, the character and the motivation. And then when you look at all of that in the context of Philippians 2, you see that ultimately the motivation is driven by, what do my people need? And if I can minister out of my strengths, because that meets their need, that's wonderful. But don't be afraid if, on occasion, in order to meet the needs of your people, God stretches you beyond your strengths and asks you to work and minister out of your weaknesses, because his strength is made perfect in weakness.
Thank you, David. Well, I want to pick up actually right along the same lines as Greg kind of talked about the power of preaching and the fact that we can cast a vision, that the way we can motivate folks from the pulpit is really powerful. John Wesley himself actually spoke to the fact that if all we have is preaching, that in fact in talking about class meetings and band meetings, I mentioned this in my workshop yesterday, but folks can get more out of 1 hour of close discourse with one another than 10 years of public preaching. Now, John Wesley, of course, is not speaking negatively about preaching. We were talking about this at lunch today. He might have preached more, sometimes 4 times a day, often by 5 o'clock in the morning is up preaching. Might have preached more than any other soul that ever walked the face of the earth. So he believed in the power of the preached word. The society sermons were an hour long, for instance. I mean, they preached. But if it's not connected then with the way in which we interact and lead people, the way we get folks, in the context of the early Methodists, for instance, into small group with one another, where a culture of discipleship can really happen, then without those things coupled together, then our preaching is not as effective as it can be. And so just in terms of this humility that David's been speaking about, one of the things that really strikes me is that most of us are leading in contexts where the strategies we've used in the past, so even if we have a clear sense of the why, some of the how that we've used in the past doesn't work the same way as it used to, because the culture around us has changed so dramatically. The world that we live in is very different than it used to be, and it's easier for us to kind of, I get the picture sometimes that the church functions like you've seen little kids that don't want to hear something and they stick their fingers in their ear, la 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 la, and just pretend that the world is not as complex and complicated as it actually is. And in terms of leadership, with humility in the world that we live in today, the way I see that Christ-likeness playing out often is the ability to say, I don't know. To be able to actually admit, I don't have the answers for this. There's a scholar at Harvard by the name of Ronald Heifetz that refers to this as adaptive leadership. He has a very interesting context. He's a medical doctor and also a Harvard business professor. But one of the interesting dynamics, he's actually speaking out of his own experience being a doctor and the fact that patients would come to him for the answers. And he asks the question, what do you say if you don't know? I mean, if you have a patient that has some ailment and you don't know the answer to it, the patient expects you to know the answer. And his admission is that many doctors fake it, as if that's what's better for the patient. And unfortunately, this is actually what a lot of leaders do. Instead of exhibiting the kind of humility that David's talking about, we have this assumption that it actually is better for the sake of our organization, our church, whatever, if we at least pretend we know what we're doing. But what if we don't? And it's actually quite refreshing to be able to admit, I don't know. I mean, how do you enter in, to go back to the sermon from today, how do you enter into relationship with people who are different than you are? The only way to learn is to actually engage that. And what's fascinating to me, and a couple of us got in a conversation about this a little while ago, is part of the way that we learn is by engaging the people in the conversation. And so Ronald Heifetz actually uses the language of if you're facing adaptive challenges, in other words, the kind of things that you don't already have answers to that are going to cause us to have to change, us to have to adapt the way that we live and lead, then the best way to engage those challenges is to give the problem back to the people. Don't try to fix it yourself. Give the problem back to the people. And it's an example for me of precisely what David's talking about, of having the kind of humility to say, look, I don't know how to answer this question, but I'm convinced that we can figure it out together as the Spirit gives us guidance. And so for me, this is a picture of Acts chapter 15, where the Council of Jerusalem happens. And I mean, this is, thankfully, we're none of us going to face a decision as hard in our own local churches as they're facing in Acts 15. Do the Gentiles have to become Jews in order to be Christians? This is my summary of this context. And we don't know how long the Council of Jerusalem goes on, but I imagine a lot of prayer. I imagine a lot of discussion, which is also framed in as argument. I think there were differences of opinion. Imagine if you were a Jew thinking, are we really going to give up all of this heritage and simply say Jesus is enough? I mean, that's a hard decision. That's an adaptive challenge. Nobody has the answer for that. And I'm only thinking that like James, Peter, and John, some of these guys are looking around at each other like, did Jesus tell us about this before he left? Because this had been, you remember that where Jesus says, I have many more things to tell you, but you're not ready for those. And so when the Spirit comes, He'll reveal to you. This is one of those moments for them. And the passage ends, one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture, Acts 15:28, where James, not Peter or Paul, but James stands up and says, it seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us. And they had discerned some of the how together. The who and the why were clear for them. But out of humility, rather than I have the answers, or I can figure this out, or I'll fake my way until I figure it out, they put the problem out there together. And they prayed and discerned together. And folks, I don't know another way to find our way through the challenges that we face in 2017 with the world that we're in, whether it's racism, all kinds of cultural divisions right now. I don't know about the rest of you. I've never experienced so much division right now, both in the church and outside the church. People are angry. And we're connected with the kind of hope that is the answer for this. But how do we find out how to engage that, how to enter in and call to and walk with in the midst of this? Those are not things that just go up on the mountain and figure this out and then tell everybody else. We've got to find a way to come together with the folks we're leading with. And so it's why I really resonate with a shared kind of team way of thinking about leadership, where the role the pastor plays is critically important. And as Greg said, we get the opportunity that when we see the vision happening, we can point at it. most of you have a perspective that others in your congregation couldn't possibly have. You get a chance to see when it's actually working, to be able to lift up the stories and illustrate, hey, see that? That's what we're after. How do we get more of that? And yet to engage others in the conversation, in the dialogue, where we're learning together, both inside the church, and then, as a couple of us were talking about a little while ago, if you're engaging with people, trying to figure out how to find your way into relationship and, quote unquote, enter into conversation with folks who are unchurched, it's a good set of people to actually have conversation with about how to reach other folks, not just sit around with a bunch of church people, try to figure out how to reach people, but engage with the folks that are actually living in that kind of brokenness. And as most of us have discovered, it's not, in a lot of ways, not that much different than the brokenness we already experience.
Yeah.
The brokenness that Jesus went through. And so we have an opportunity to, with humility, to really enter into a relationship and to be willing to say, I don't know, but we can figure this out together as the Spirit guides us. And so with those things in mind, just some of the things that we've shared in the last few minutes, we want to open this up to some conversation. Shelby Ray and Andrea have microphones. They're going to kind of mill the room so that everyone will be able to hear the questions and the comments, reflections that you raise. And as long as you have questions, we're glad to stay in here and have conversation. But we want this to be about the kind of things that the Lord is really bringing to the surface in your own lives and in your minds today. So the two of them are going to kind of mill the room. And so any questions, reflections, comments from some of what you've heard either today or even throughout the last couple days that you'd like for us to have some conversation about today?
Well, let's all go take a nap then.
Yeah.
No. Back here.
All right.
We want to get it on
We
tape.
got to get it on tape, right?
Yeah, we want to get it on tape.
Yeah, I want to ask you guys a couple questions. Number one, the first question is, what are 3 significant trends that you see that give you hope? I think I just framed that question, my 2 questions into one. What are 3 significant trends that you see, not only in the church, but through the church, that gives you hope for tomorrow?
I think for me, one of the most significant trends is an increasing recognition by people in positions of power and authority that they alone do not have the answer. That this collaborative approach, and again, I think it's very consistent with our understanding of pneumatology in terms of the work and ministry of the Holy Spirit. In Old Testament times, the Holy Spirit was active, but only with a very few. With Jesus breathing on the disciples, and then at Pentecost, when the Spirit then was poured out on all, there is now this theological underpinning for the idea that the collaborative, as we've been talking about today, coming together in community, and for essentially those who lead to be facilitators of the discovery. Here in Kentucky, one of the major undertakings, particularly in eastern Kentucky, is quilt making. And the way quilts are made, often there's a person, she's often called the queen bee, she of the quilting bee, and she will put out a call to say, we're going to make a quilt. And she'll invite all of the other people who are quilt makers to come and bring their pieces, and old fabric and leftover fabrics, etc. They'll gather together, they'll have this discussion about what kind of a quilt do we want to make. What pattern? Is it going to be intersecting rings or the various patterns that they'll make that decision, and then the queen of the quilting bee essentially will give kind of the parameters and will then empower those who are there with her to begin stitching their piece of fabric into the quilt. And I'm told that if you know the community of quilters, after the quilt is finished, while it looks like a coordinated whole, obviously, those who know the quilters in that community can actually go in and say, that piece was quilted by Mary Jude, and that one was by Beth Ann, and that one was quilted, because their stitching techniques are very distinctive. So one of the trends that I'm most encouraged by is an increasing recognition of this need for us in terms of leadership to be facilitators and coordinators with the confidence that since the Holy Spirit has been poured out on those who have come to accept Jesus Christ, resident in them and through them is the fabric and the stitching techniques necessary to move us in the direction we need to move.
Yeah. The first thing that just jumps into my head when you ask that question is the enormous growth, the global church, the enormous growth of our Father's family, our family, to the south, as Philip Jenkins talks about, Latin and South America, Africa, parts of Africa, and much of Asia. And more than just that it's growing, but the influence that it is, by God's grace, more and more, but it's beginning to have on the rather dead church in Western Europe and the somewhat stagnant church in our own North America here. And I can just give so many examples. One of the things in Jenkins' second book that he talked about is that when people who have been coming to Jesus through these miraculous ways, and I've gotten to meet so many of them, read the Bible, it speaks with immediacy. When they read it, they hear God's voice in it, and with authority. When they see what it calls them to do, they feel like we must do it. And that here, even in our more biblically sound, grounded, whatever word we want to use, churches, it seems like, and sometimes this has happened in the academy, we have learned to be able to explain away some of the hard demands of Scripture with our exegesis. And I feel like what I see happening is the growth of the global church is calling us back to a much more, what would I say, simple and authentic faith. I mean, we have so much to contribute from what we have. But you can see this in many places. One of the places, for example, is in the global Anglican Church,
Yes.
where in Western Europe and in North America, there's been so much of a departure from this kind of historic biblical Christian faith centered in the gospel. And then when you meet those who are in the Anglican confession that come out of other parts of the world, they are calling us back again to that. And I think that is one of the healthy things. It's God's letting his family be a corrective to one another. The old notion that we are the ones who are going to go and teach everybody else how to do it. We're finding out the opposite is really happening. And there's still much for us to teach. I mean, there really is. We've been blessed. We've had, books and Christian radio. We've music. And so we have so much that we have to take and contribute. But I'll tell you, with regard to that genuine, Spirit-led, biblically grounded faith, one of the most encouraging things happening in the world is that. And we desperately need it. Second thing, can I just say, I won't go three, because I want you guys to pick that up. I'll go three. This one will surprise you that I find it to be encouraging. There has been a significant part of our world, even though we know that the Bible teaches that the gospel is going to go to all people groups in the world, and even though we know that when the work is done, people from all people groups will be around the throne. So we'll declare, it'll be preached to all the world, and when you get to Revelation 5, 8, 9, get to Revelation 7, 9, there will actually be people from every people group around the world. But there have been lots of people groups who have been just almost completely unreachable. They've often been in more Muslim contexts. You can sometimes get computer people or agriculturalists or so forth into some of the country, but it's been almost impossible, and especially to give any kind of a witness that wouldn't put you into great threat. Right now, in the last couple of years, there has been a repopulation, a forcing of people out of their homelands in numbers unprecedented. It has created for us political debates as a nation about refugees and so forth, but for us as followers of Jesus, it may be giving us the greatest opportunity to have people who are no longer trapped in their culture zones to have an authentic, loving Christian witness, to be there. So our church has put together several teams and has sent them into Turkey, to Germany. And it's overwhelming. I mean, the impossible part of this is, I mean, you can deal with a couple of hundreds. What do you do when you have a couple million? I don't know. God knows. All I know is that Jesus always talked about seeds. And the seeds of the kingdom are planted, and they seem to be so small and sometimes ineffective. But he says, if you're sowing the seeds of the kingdom through the gospel, it's going to grow to be big. And so I think the second thing I would just mention is what I see that many people, and it is hard to have these families be uprooted from homes and all, but it's still the greatest opportunity for the spreading of the gospel, I think, in my entire lifetime.
Can I just short tail on that, because Dr. Greg Okeson, who is our resident missiologist and dean of the E. Stanley Jones School of Evangelism and World Missions, really believes that we are experiencing the greatest diaspora in the history of humanity.
It is true.
And it's being, Satan means it for evil, but God means it for good. And there's this opportunity now, as Greg has indicated, because we can't go to them, they now are becoming available to us. And one of our fastest growing emphasis at the master's level, as well as at the doctoral level, is church planting among diaspora groups. Yeah. And so we have an opportunity here, and I think that's, rather than looking at all of this immigration stuff in such a negative kind of light, we see it as perhaps God's opportunity to go to those and who we couldn't go to before, but who are now coming to us. So.
Well, I mean, these are some of the same things that I would speak to, and so gets me super excited. We have a lot to learn, to engage with in conversation, right, but a lot to learn from what God is doing in the world. I'm encouraged to know the church is growing more rapidly now than it ever has in history. Yeah. We don't feel that where most of us live. We feel just the opposite, but there is hope. Because of that. I think your question is really important because hope turns out to be really, really important. And in a lot of places where we serve, we've got just the opposite. And so one of the other things that is a trend that really encourages me is, and it comes along with some of the same kind of things that have already been mentioned in terms of shared leadership and understanding. But one of the things that really strikes me is that there's an emphasis again on really discipling people, where a whole lot of what many of us have experienced, even unfortunately in Wesleyan churches, is an overemphasis on conversion, and then everything else is kind of gravy after that. And that's what John Wesley was so passionate about, because that was true in his own day, is that there was so much emphasis on just this point of justification, and nothing else really mattered that much. Wesley wanted to see people actually become like Jesus and believed it was possible in this life. And so that's one of the trends that I see as most encouraging, that there are people really digging into what does it look like to disciple people, to be disciples ourselves, and to create the kind of culture, context, environments around us that are actually designed to get that kind of fruit, where people are actually becoming like Christ in accountable relationships. And so there's a whole movement in church planting right now where people are starting with discipleship instead of just evangelism, that it's a bigger picture of what is good news for people. It is certainly good news to not go to hell. But there's more good news than just that we can actually be a part of this mission with God in incarnational kinds of ways, live this life that God has called us to here. And that's one of the trends that I'm most excited about. In addition to these other things, people are coming to Christ. It's quite fascinating that there are people in places where the church is growing really rapidly. They're asking for, how do we disciple people? Yeah. In places like most of us live, where we got a lot of stagnant Christians and a lot of churchgoers, members, whatever, but not really disciples, we're asking the same questions, but for very different reasons. And so the fact that people are actually asking these questions, that folks are digging into experiments, whether they succeed or fail in our own eyes, digging into experiments of actually growing as disciples, that's one of the trends in addition to these other things that have been mentioned that really gets me excited, gives me hope for the world we live in today. So, anybody else?
I want to ask a question from a United Methodist perspective, and I realize that not everyone here is United Methodist. In my own annual conference, two of our largest churches have discerned that it is time for them to leave, to peacefully leave the denomination. And our bishop sent out an email today, and one of our larger rural churches, they had a discernment charged church conference on Sunday, and they too have voted, a large number of that church, to resign their membership. Their pastors turned in their credentials, and they have gone their other way. I hear you all talking about transformation of the world, and I understand what you're saying about that. But would it not be a question that we need to ask, can the world be transformed by the gospel if the very church is not transformed? And I'm not saying that all churches are not being transformed by the gospel, but as a United Methodist, there are many United Methodist churches that are growing and moving forward, and lives are being transformed. But there are a lot of United Methodist churches that that's not happening. Do we not have to be transformed as the church before we can work at transforming the community?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. And there are a lot of dynamics, a lot of complexities to this. Yeah. One of the long before some of the issues going on right now in the United Methodist Church, I remember being in a coaching situation in one particular church, and a person raised this question: shouldn't we get healthy before we try to give this away to somebody else? And if you have, that makes perfect sense in the sense of our physical bodies, for instance. If I got cancer, I gotta get this taken care of before I, can really do other things with my life. But if part of what it means for us to be healthy is to give this away, then the notion, in fact, John Wesley, and he learned this from the Moravians, but the whole idea of focusing just on our own spiritual health, he saw to be a real danger. It's why even the class meetings all were required to be in mission, not just accountable relationships for their spiritual growth. And so first and foremost, that kind of connection for me is important, that's part of how we get healthy. And so that piece to it. Beyond that, the other thing, I'll speak to it, and then I'll let these guys share with this as well. I was in a conversation actually with a set of Methodist pastors this week. And one of the things that is, as folks are in the midst of these kind of situations, there's as I said, a lot of complexity, and there's a sense that we've got to make a decision for what's best for our own congregation, whatever. But anytime, this is just systems kind of stuff, but anytime somebody exits, it further promotes unhealth in the existing organization. Doesn't matter what kind of system you're talking about. And so if there's, it's the beautiful thing about being in a system, whether it's the Methodist system or any other for that matter, represented in this room, is that transformation can start from anywhere. And those that are being transformed and want to see a different kind of world, if we just keep exiting the systems we're in, we further promote what Robert Quinn would call slow death in those existing organizations. And so it's one of the things for me, they've got to do what they think is right in terms of integrity, but it's one of the things for me is to help people at least understand the implications of, if you want health, and that's part of what I hear you saying, transformation and health in a system like the United Methodist Church, then those who are experiencing it have to be part of the solution, not just get out of the way. And so that for me is at least one perspective on some of what you're speaking to. So I don't know how the others of you would respond.
I'm sort of the outsider here, so I'll jump in and then you can clean up whatever right. I have to say. I was thinking today...
Where's the shovel?
I hope you see me as your brother in Christ, because I was thinking today, if you who are in the tradition that usually has been served by Asbury are in the teknon, I'm still in the paideia. I'm still in the sort of, I get the crumbs, I get to be, but I'm a part of the household with you, and I'm really thrilled about that, even though I have to tell you, I feel like in many ways I belong with you more than I often do in many of the places where I've usually been.
Well, we can arrange for that, you know. That's right.
I was already thinking, I wanted to say, I wonder if I could hire Bryan away to come out to our church. I love how you approach these things. You know, I'll tell you what my first thought there, I don't know if it has any help with this at all. But when I think about this, if we can't get our churches transformed, is there any expectation that the world can be transformed? And then I thought, well, all I know is that it's going to be. I mean, Jesus said he will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. It's going to happen. So if our churches so depart from the gospel, and it's the loss if we're not involved in what God is already doing in this world, he will raise somebody else up to do it. So I felt that I've come into this 120-year-old church that has a great history, and it's done so many things. I mean, World Vision started out of my church, Fuller Seminary started out of my church, Missionary Aviation Fellowship, probably things, I don't know if you've heard of any of these, all of it started out of this church. But I thought, if we just sort of stagnate here and become happy doing what we've always done, God will just raise somebody else up.
Yeah, that's right.
To figure out new ways to bring that unchanging gospel into this ever-changing world. I think, so as I've been hearing, and it's funny, I've heard about the challenges in the United Methodist Church from all places where I've heard it is on secular radio. And so coming here and getting to talk with you about some of that has made me really a prayer partner with so many of you about this, that God will give you tremendous wisdom and then courage. I thought today, as I just touched upon the John 17 text, I'll pray that you will be one, and so I go and try to talk about who is in that, all of them who are one. But there's a significant phrase there too, those who will believe the message. In other words, there is a message of the gospel that must be embraced and believed and held to and to direct us. If we call ourselves a church but no longer hold to the heart of the gospel that has held God's people together, the centerpieces of who God is, the authority of the Bible, it is salvation through Jesus Christ, through faith, and through no one else. If we lose the message, then there's nothing really to call people to believe. So I don't know how that plays out, but those are things that I think have to be articulated by God's people who believe in that gospel message in those difficult places, and with the deep prayer that the larger movement might come back to the heart of what our whole Christian faith is all about. So those are my, the Japanese friends of mine, when I go over there, they always say, Greg, you got to tell us what your new eyes see. This is a good sermon illustration. You got to tell us what your new eyes see. Because after you've been here for a few weeks, you'll just see the same way we do. That they know that your new eyes are not going to see things quite right, so you can't see. But at the same time, you may see some things that other people don't quite see who are there. So those are a couple of the new things that I see with my eyes.
My experience is more with the Presbyterian Church USA. I left here after my stint here at the seminary and went back to pastor the largest PCUSA church in the Norfolk Presbytery in Norfolk, Virginia Beach area. And the PCUSA was a merger between Northern Presbyterians and Southern Presbyterians. And one of the conditions of the merger was that the Southern Presbyterians would have up to a decade to decide whether or not they wanted to remain in the new merged denomination. And the Kempsville Presbyterian Church was running a couple of thousand people on Sunday morning, by far the largest active PCUSA church in that particular presbytery. Very evangelical, lean charismatic too, which is an interesting kind of experience. And they were determined to, as the PCUSA and particularly the Norfolk Presbytery, which was one of the more liberal presbyteries within the PCUSA, began to move further and further and further away from the essentials of the faith, that the eldership at Kempsville really made a decision that they would stay and would be salt and light for just as long as they possibly could. And they would show up at all of the presbytery meetings. They would be a part of presbytery committees. they would be sure that the evangelical voice was not lost, because what they had observed, which I thought was quite interesting, was that liberalization of various theological groups occurred when the evangelicals, the conservatives and the fundamentalists in the best sense of that term, began to pull away from and no longer were willing to take the heat for basically standing their ground. And so KPC for the 10 years did that, and I finished my first stint with them, left, and was involved in another situation, and they had another pastoral turnover, and in the 10th year, they asked me to come back as their interim pastor to guide them through a final decision. So I'm a Methodist. The good thing about the liberal nature of the Norfolk Presbytery is they didn't care I was a Methodist. It didn't matter to them. So I was called in to kind of help them think this through. And the congregation really struggled with this, really struggled. And the condition of the merger was that any local congregation could leave, but they could only keep their properties if they merged with another recognized Presbyterian denominational group. And so we had some close fellowship with the EPCA, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church of America, and it finally came to a point in that 10th year where the clock was counting down, where the decision had to be made. And the majority of because it's a congregational form of government with elders and deacons giving guidance to that, the congregation voted about 2/3 of them to leave and to join the EPCA, and a third voted not to leave. And it was one of the most difficult times because of the conviction of those who did not want to leave, that they weren't ready yet to give up on the denomination. And so we dropped in attendance after that decision was made from 2,000, 2,500 or so on Sunday morning down to about 1,400, 1,500, and then gradually grew from that point. Those who left, we left blessing them and amicably supporting them and actually laying hands on many of their leadership, their lay leadership, anointing them and blessing them to continue to be the salt and light in the denomination. And to this day, they still continue, that particular group, to populate the systems of the PCUSA, hoping that somehow God, who has promised that he will build his church, will somehow use them as instruments. Now, who was right and wrong? The answer is they were both right. Because they did exactly what they felt God, in their spiritual discernment, had called them to do. And so I think that's, and again, I'm not a United Methodist, I'm a Free Methodist. My brother here is one of these evangelical Anglicans, and so we don't have as much vested, and as a result, much angst in the United Methodist dilemmas right now. But with half of our student body being United Methodist, obviously we share in that angst. But I'm not sure that helps answer your question at all. But that was my experience with a church that, and they tried many strategies. One of the things that the Norfolk Presbytery began to support certain kinds of causes with our congregational allotment that we were uncomfortable with. And so, and this was negotiated with the Presbytery leadership, we designated our allotment. We basically said that and it was a sizable allotment because we were the biggest, and maybe that was what helped, because it was either that or get no money. Okay, I mean, we tried to be kind about that, but we were saying either you let us designate for causes that the Presbytery supports that we can support in good conscience, or we're going to withhold our allotment. And so we tried a wide variety of strategies, but in the end, it came down to a decision that was made very prayerfully and without animosity, in a way that we hope benefits both the PCUSA and now in the EPCA, is because we have emerged at Kempsville Press as one of the larger churches in the EPCA denomination. Another question? I think there was a brother down here that had a question next, I believe. Then there's another one back in the back up here. Another one here.
Kind of picking up on what Dr. Gyertson was saying about immigrants and diaspora and the whole question of refugees. I've read several articles recently talking about the church needing to speak prophetically into that situation, compassion and justice for the immigrant and the alien and the orphan, the most vulnerable.
You've read the Bible. Yeah.
Pardon?
I said you've read the Bible.
Yeah.
So what does that look like for a local church pastor to speak prophetically to people in power about that? How does the average pastor in a church of 70 people in a Nowheresville speak prophetically regarding that?
Question.
It is a great question. Brian, you and David say, if you just say, well, I don't quite know, it's probably the best.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. You notice we're all looking at you.
All right, I always look for, sometimes I just don't quite know what to do. Well, sometimes. I feel like every moment of my life I don't quite know. And I pray for, I long for just enough clarity to know what the next step is.
Yeah.
What is the next step? And I know, look where I'm located. It's a little different from where you are. I mean, I grew up more probably in a neighborhood like you are, so I mean, I understand that, even though all of our small rural communities are becoming, the world is moving into everywhere. So I see it everywhere I go. Bluefield, well, I won't go into that. See, I was trying to get off of the hard question by talking about other things.
Yeah, how about them cats? Did you watch the game last night? It's a deflection there.
No, but I will tell you, so where we're located, of course, we have a huge immigrant population. People who look like me are in the minority in San Gabriel Valley. And many of those who are coming into our city and have been coming into our city for a long, long time are undocumented. So you can even use here with me using that term, that's different from saying illegal, isn't it? You see, so even there, I'm kind of showing you. So I look at the Bible and I say, and if my wife were here, she and I wrestle with this all the time. She comes from immigrant parents who both did that hard work of getting their citizenship. I mean, and so the disrespect for those who aren't going to go through that hard work to do. So even their husband and wife, we pray and talk about this so much. But once again, I start with this simplistic, maybe simple pattern of entering in. So we enter into relationships with the people that God brings to our community. It seems to me to be so consistent with the way I see in the Old Testament. When you have the immigrant come into your community, then you've got to begin to treat them in a different way. I have to let the government deal with the legal issues, but from my responsibility, I think, is to enter into the relationship where I see the broken families, where I see them not having enough food to eat. I enter in and try to bring Christ-like help and compassion and justice in those situations, so that we have just a Spanish-speaking church that runs 400 to 500 people. The pastor, he's kind of, I call it, we're two old dog pastors. We just want to follow what the Bible tells us to do. And I asked him about this question. I said, Jorge, what do we do about that? He said, well, to tell you the truth, even though I don't know for sure, we have about 70% of our people probably that don't have documentation. We have a lot of, if you know the language, of dreamers. We have so many of the kids in our youth group have been here since they were 1 year old, and some of them didn't even know that they were undocumented until they try to go and get some scholarship money. So I try to enter into their lives, invite them to become a part of our church family. We try to walk with them through the inevitable huge challenges they have of adjusting to being within our community. But there do come those times when we have to call to my next one. What does it mean to live in the United States with Jesus as your Lord? Does that, I mean, that's a question that comes not early on. I mean, not early on from me. So that's how we've approached. I kind of get these biblical first steps, entering into the relationship, calling them to faith in Jesus. But then when you do that, then you start hearing the stories. I'll just tell you one more. Another guy, his name is also Jorge. I got to know him and develop a friendship with him because I go to one of the restaurants that's owned by one of our church people, and they have the valet parking out there, if you've ever been or you see it there. And so I've gotten to know him and love him as a brother. He's come to know Jesus. But then when you find out why he's here, it's in Guatemala where he was in. There was no work. He had 2 little boys. They were starving to death. He felt like he had a decision. Will he come into the United States and break the law, or will he let his boys starve? His boys are still back in Guatemala. He works almost a non-paying job in one of the most expensive communities in the entire United States to live in, and yet somehow he holds on to. He lives in this house that is just jammed with like 20 people in a 2 or 3 bedroom place. I mean, these are the realities of our world. And so what do I do in those situations? Report him? I've chosen not to. So we'll take this step by step by step. So it's kind of like I feel like, Lord, give me the next step that I take. I'm your servant. You're my Lord. I want to be a good citizen in my country. I want our church to also be a place that kind of like you say, when your people are here and immigrants come in, you've got to make sure that you don't eat all the food. You don't eat all the food off the field so that they can't have any. And that's the approach that I've sought to take. I keep praying, and I would long for you to pray that I will be wisdom, that we don't want to dishonor the name of the Lord. Instead, we want to further the glory of the Lord, and that's how I've approached that really difficult question.
One of the things that comes to my mind just in response to this before we move to the next question is, and Greg has just modeled it for us, but there's a way to live prophetically, not only speak prophetically. And we typically think of something prophetic being what we speak, but oftentimes people don't have relationship in such a way to have influence, so that when we speak prophetically, it falls on deaf ears. And when we live prophetically in the way he's describing, then we have the kind of authority, the kind of influence to speak prophetically in a different kind of way. And so just an add-on to that is that if we indeed have compassion for people, we're not just trying to make noise, and cause a scene, being prophetic, if we indeed have compassion, and to go back to David's comment a little while ago, our point of view is on the lead, not what I want to say, then we go about living prophetically in such a way that gives us then the authority to speak prophetically. So.
I serve a Methodist church. And in the Methodist Church, in the recent years, they've come up with a program which they call Rethink Church, which on the surface seems like a very good idea. It hits on a lot of what you all have been talking about. But recently I attended wasn't a seminar, it was a presentation by some folks that took the Rethink Church perhaps a little further than I think may have been intended. There's a question coming, but let me... What these people were doing, they had quit going to their regular church, of course, and they went out and were meeting people where they were, and then as they began to describe it more and more, they were meeting them in a Mexican restaurant at happy hour, and they were indulging in happy hour along with the people they were meeting. And I just wonder how far we should go out. Would you like to comment on that? How far is too far?
Yeah.
So that we destroy our witness before we're able to win them.
I am telling you, that's an awfully good. I wanted easy questions like how many children do you have and what's your dog's name? And those kind of things. All right, now, of course, here we go. Here's the preacher in me. When the sermon, you heard my sermon this morning, and you look at what Jesus did. I mean, he reached all the way out. I mean, he would have been there at that place. Now, the issue is, and I see it with many of us, when I push people to go out and enter into those relationships and they go into certain places, they also give up the distinctive way of living and the moral commands and demands of the gospel when they go into those places. Jesus did not do that. And that's the really hard thing, is that so many times I find so many of our people, I don't want to just say our younger adults, though I start thinking that way. It's probably because I'm getting older here. But, you know, I push, we've got to carry the gospel where people you'll never come into church. And then they get into those situations, and actually the greater influence is going the other way. However, at the same time, I think the model of Jesus that we have really would encourage us being willing to go as far as we should go. I'll be telling an illustration tomorrow that will probably just be shocking to you. How much time do we have? I'll tell it really quickly. So this will be a kind of a beginning of what I do. I'm learning from our missionaries. I am learning from our missionaries about how to actually communicate the gospel into a completely different kind of a world. And so I went and visited two of our missionaries in Thailand. I don't know if you've ever met Randy and Edie Nelson. He came to know Christ at Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo, California. And Edie is a third-generation missionary. So she insisted that he become a Christian first because he fell in love with her and he wanted to marry her. And then she said, but I'm not going to marry you unless you become a missionary. Well, I mean, okay, I'll become a missionary. But then he had to go back and get some of the training and do all this stuff. But the thing I laugh about with Randy, he hasn't been in church enough to figure out what God can't do. He just thinks that this God who makes everything by speaking can do anything. You know what I'm getting at there? Sometimes don't we just figure out, well, God can't really do that, so we won't even ask him. But Randy hasn't figured that out yet. So when he went to the mission agency, the only one who would take a green Christian like him, and they said there are two places. One of them's too hard. It burns out missionaries. So we're going to send you to this. They said, no, I want to go to the hard one. So they sent them. They sent them to these nomadic people that go across Tanzania and Kenya, and that nobody could ever get hold of, and burned out missionaries. And within 14 years, almost the entire tribe had come to know Christ. They were disciples and were sending out missionaries to other nomadic tribes. So their work was done. They went then, believe it or not, you would send a man like this to another tribe like that, wouldn't you? No, he went to the major world-class city of Bangkok, Thailand, and then into Pattaya, the center of trafficking in all of Asia. And so I went there about 2 years after he was there, and I went to the most amazing church that I've ever seen. All people who have been rescued out of the bars and the trafficking and the sex life and all that is there. And I said, Randy, how do you do this? How do you even do this? Where do you start? How can I learn to do this? And this enter in stuff happens. He said, well, I decided. He said, I walk into places, and he says I've made it better than it was that he did it. So I've kind of put it he said, I walk into places, and I say, Jesus comes to make everything right. So when justice reigns, the word justice means everything right. So I walk into a neighborhood or a society, and I say, what's wrong around here? And he says, pretty much you find everything is wrong. So then I ask, what's really wrong? And I recognized some things here that were really wrong. Families starving to death, sending their children into the trafficking industry, seeing them there getting off the buses at age 12, 13 years old. And he said, that's really wrong. So what he decided to do was he had to celebrate their lives as people made in the image of God. He took out the big Westin, the most expensive place in all of Pattaya, to celebrate their lives. The churches there criticized him heavily. You're going to ruin our witness. You're going to have all those people there, you know, all that stuff that we feel, right? I mean, I understand it. And I said, you didn't even tell me about it. Yeah, I was afraid you wouldn't support me anymore if I told you, if I told you about it. And but that evening, they celebrated the And these were people who had come out of mostly Buddhist, if any kind of background, mostly Buddhist backgrounds, the way that Jesus Christ values their life. That evening, 76 mostly women showed up, and they all came to faith. The next week, over double that showed up. Almost all of them came to faith, and out of that came this very, very unusual church. I've never been in a church like it. When I preached there the first time, he said, "Greg, I'm afraid we're becoming too much like just a traditional old church. You've got to help me with this." After about a half hour, I leaned over to him and I said, "Randy, the thing you shouldn't have to worry about, that this is a tradition. I've never seen anything. I won't even, it would be worth telling the stories because I like to tell stories. All that is to say, somehow, we who carry the gospel must be ourselves growing enough in our faith, longing to live holy lives before Jesus, that we can go anywhere and say, listen, Jesus has a better way for you to live. I know you look at a church like ours and they see our big, massive building and they think it's all the institutional stuff that they hate. But I just try to say that it really is real. And so I wouldn't want to say, I have the fear on two sides. On one side, if we open it up too much, I'm afraid of our people going into those places just adapting that lifestyle. On the other side, I think even my greatest fear is that we won't even go and carry the gospel. And so if I'm going to err, I want to err on the side of let's go there.
It wasn't the going that was bothersome to me. It was the fact that he was imbibing in the
There we go. There we go. Well, that's exactly what I was saying. All right, we got to live a distinctive lifestyle when we go into those places. Where are you from originally?
Tennessee.
Oh, I knew you were from close to my home. So anyway, I could tell. It's beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. That's where I go with that. Sorry I spoke so long.
No, that's good. That's good. Another question back, way at the back, yeah.
I won't speak on this. Good.
Thank you. I think we partially, yesterday, Dr. Gunnarsson, you were talking, or you mentioned about cultural engagement. And to express that out better, it seems cultural engagement is kind of a difficult term because people today are engaging culture and it seems making compromises.
Yeah.
That's saying culture is okay. The other side is if we engage culture, we might seem reactionary, or as has been mentioned, prophetic, which might be reactionary also. But another aspect of engaging culture will change. So we sometimes have the option of just sitting on the bench and waiting a generation or so for the culture to change. So I was interested to hear your reaction as you flesh out a little more what you were speaking about of cultural change yesterday.
Yeah.
Engagement.
Yeah, culture engagement. You want me, or you guys want to jump in?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is understanding where we're best equipped to and called to bring a witness into the cultural context where God has placed us. And I think, again, words need and phrases need definitions, obviously, but I think when we talk about cultural engagement from a Christian worldview impact perspective, what we're really talking about is helping people kind of discover how they can be the salt and light in a specific cultural context to which God has called them. Get a little personal here and talk about my daughter and son-in-law, who while they were here at Asbury College, really felt a call to missionary service in Hollywood. And so they were trained here at Asbury University. My daughter's a scriptwriter. My son-in-law is a director-producer. They're in Hollywood. They've been there now for almost 18 years as salt and light, trying to figure out ways to earn the right to speak. They've really taken on this idea that, of Peter's, that essentially we need to give a reason for the hope that lies within us. And so they've been working systematically in one of the most, at least in their minds, and I would agree, one of the most influential cultural contexts globally, that our Western media, our U.S. media, has more impact than perhaps all of our military might and anything else you want to talk about in terms of radio, television, and film, particularly TV and film. And so I think that for me, the key is for people to understand what God's specific call is for them. And you have to go in terms of a cultural engagement and earn the right to speak. Andrea and Brady often share that their biggest challenge for being Christ's salt and Christ's light in Hollywood are other Christians who come in there and think that they're on a crusade and have various ways of confronting culture as opposed to influencing culture. And so I think that as we think about where God might be calling us as salt and light missionaries, the challenge is, and we have a whole thing here at Asbury Seminary right now called the Office of Faith, Work, and Economics. Because in addition to the media, we believe that the business environment is one of the least evangelized, witnessed areas in. And so we're now working with, we actually have a Doctor of Ministry track starting this summer, helping pastors understand the opportunities of integrating faith into the workplace and equipping their congregations to see that if they have an opportunity in a workplace, how to be more effective in terms of witnessing as salt and light in that particular workplace. So I think that's part of the challenge that we have in pastoral leadership, is to encourage our people to discover where God already has them, and then equip them, first motivationally, because I think that's one of the things Andrew and Brady runs into constantly. The media tends to attract egomaniacs. It's all about money, and it's about power, and it's about egotism. And so a lot of Christians who are attracted to being missionaries to the media have got to overcome some of their own egotistical motivations for wanting to be in front of the camera or wanting to be whatever in media that they want to be. But I think that we're in an era now where we need to figure out, particularly within the context of church disciple making, how we better equip people to become salt and light right where God has miraculously placed them. It might be at McDonald's, it could be in the parking, station, parking attendant, or it could be a CEO, and what's been happening in Hollywood, which is so fascinating. My daughter worked initially for Warner Brothers, and the young lady who was the executive assistant to Warner Brothers, president, asked for permission. He's a secular Jew, and by the way, most of the success in Hollywood has Jewish connections. It's secular Jews who've really gotten into the media. And she asked permission if she could hold a prayer meeting in his office once a week to pray over him and over the company. And the result of that was that it awakened within Warner Brothers so many Christians that had been kind of doing their thing, but not necessarily finding opportunity, that during my daughter's time there were, I think she said, over 300 Bible studies meeting across the Warner complex early in the morning or at noon at lunch hour, and slowly seeping into that particular calling. So I think that when we talk about cultural engagement, it really is better equipping those who already have a place in culture. They already have an influential position within the culture. God's planted them there. And they have not yet figured out how to be an effective witness rather than an offensive witness, an effective witness. And usually, Andrea says to a lot of people that she interacts with, is really hard on them because schlock is schlock. And if Christian schlock is still schlock. And so Andrew will say to people, if you're not going to commit to excellence in the media, please don't tell anybody you're a Christian. Because already that media is predisposed to think about Christians as being less than, or poorer than, or more incompetent than. And so earn your right to speak by working to the best of your ability and then influencing.
The other thing I'd speak to that, what's interesting about the notion of cultural engagement, we're speaking of it primarily as how do we engage the culture around us that doesn't know Christ. But no matter what kind of cultural engagement you're talking about, so let's say you've got a culture in your church that's, membership-minded, and we want to shift to being a discipleship-minded culture. How do you go about doing that? And most leaders go about it by telling or coercing, which is not a very pretty word, but telling or coercing instead of really engaging in relationship. And so as we're coaching, whether it's we're trying to engage a new kind of culture in our church, or we're trying to engage the culture out in the community, the language of creating a parallel culture is part of what we resonate with, the idea of could we actually embody something together and build relationship in such a way to have an impact. And so the way we talk about that is creating the kind of environments that would foster transformation. Most of the time when we engage people, whether it's in the church or outside the church, we engage people in ways that actually inhibit transformation instead of foster transformation. So to even think practically, have conversation with people around you, how would we engage? So this example is a beautiful one, that we need to have excellence if we're going to engage this particular culture and actually be able to influence it in a positive kind of way. Not just talk to it and try to coerce it, but to actually influence it. As kingdom bearers, we are culture shapers. No matter where we are, whether in our families, in our churches, in our communities, we are called to be culture shapers. But it's got to be in relational contexts. And so what kind of environments would foster whatever it is you feel called to see, rather than just telling it? How do we foster that? And it's a long-term view. It's not a, we're going to try to get to this quickly. It's a long-term view of how transformation can happen. But if we foster the right kind of environments, then we're actually shaping culture down the road. And so even thinking in terms of that, whether you're talking about inside the church or outside the church for that matter, and so how do we engage in the kind of relationships and foster the kind of environments that would help bring kingdom kind of fruit? That's...
Yeah.
Just coming back to this illustration quite quickly, what Andrew and Brady have found now after 18 years, and Andrew has had 8 of her movies produced, Brady's been actively involved with a wide variety, Sony, Warner Brothers, that kind of thing. When they're in positions of influence, they'll hire other Christians to be cable pullers and do the grunt work. And then they'll get permission in a film production setting. Would you mind, if crew calls at 4, we're going to call our crew at 3:30 in the morning, and a talent call maybe at 6, but crew call, and what we'll do is pull the crew together and pray together over the day and over the set. And of course, most of who they're working with are secular people, and so they want to get permission for that. And one of the things that was said to them a while back is, that's perfectly fine. Matter of fact, we prefer to have Christians on our set. And Andrea and Brady said, well, why? And they said, they show up on time, they're sober, they're not on drugs, okay? They're willing to do whatever is necessary. You talk about this servant leader, there no jobs beneath them. Well, I'm a grip, I don't do that kind of thing. Oh no, you may be a grip, but you've got an opportunity if you see something happening somewhere else to actually step out of your grip role and actually take on that particular role. And so subtly what's happening is that rather than saying it and being blatantly and usually offensively Christian, the quality of the witness begins to raise up an opportunity. One last comment. Angelina Jolie's brother is an actor as well. He's not as well known. He played the lead role in one of the productions that Andrea and Brady had a leadership role in. And they were able to cast some Christians around him. At the crew party, at the wrap party, the mother in this situation, who was Jolie's brother's mother in the movie, gave him a Bible. It's the first time he'd ever seen a Bible. And he began to weep. And he said, I don't know much about this Christian thing, but he said, I've been in this business a long time. My family's been in this business a long time. And he said, I've never been anywhere where I felt more loved and more valued and more respected. And he was smoking pot off on the side and, you know, down in whatever he was down in. But there was no condemnation. There was just, you're somebody that God loves. And that's how it was communicated. So that's how you change culture.
Yeah.
Another question or comment? How about toward the back there? There's some. Yeah. Shelby Ray, that gentleman in the back in the gray, has been trying to get his hand up several times.
It's as though I paid you to set up what I'm about to say. I was just over in the library and I picked up this card, the Office of Faith, Work, and Economics. It caught my eye. My degree is in Christian education. I'm not a theologian. I'm now a business person. I'm in the insurance business. I have no salary. I'm an independent contractor. And I have to work with an edge now I didn't have as a student here or when I was with the missions organization, who jokingly said what we need is some insurance people to go out and develop. Well, I am one now. I also work with veterans in a benefit that almost no veterans know about. And I talked with someone yesterday, and I just got a text on my phone from someone here in the Wilmore area and said, my dad needs help. Can you help him? I'm in a lot of homes, from where I started in Texas until I moved back here in Kentucky. In a lot of those places, people have never been to church, are not attracted to church at all. And yet when I talk with pastors about doing things outside the church, it's like, well, have them make an appointment and come to my office. Where is it working well? What we used to know as the lay witness movement. And what's in one of your presentations that you talked about Wesley and the group meetings, where people basically, before they ever got to a conversion experience, they were with somebody for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I have talked with numerous pastors and talked with them about integrating business into some of the things they do and asked them to get into the community, and it's like a deer in the headlights moment. It's like we didn't cover that in seminary. We didn't cover that in Bible school. And they brushed me off. I came here because for years I looked for that leadership as a layperson to disciple and to help me in that. And there was a man by the name of Stanley Tam that a lot of people know about, who I got to spend time with when I was with OMS International, who, if you don't know that name, Google it, look it up. Yeah. Tremendous Christian witness. But how do we do that? How do we get out of the church? How do we stop creating programs and sit down with people with a cup of coffee and do that so that we are the church and the salt and light into the situations like what you're talking about?
Shelby Ray, may I ask you to grab me another bottle of water when you get a chance? Thanks so much. Thanks, Ginny.
My first thought, well, we do it. I mean, that's the first thought that I had.
Just do it.
We'll just do it. All right. David was a part of our church for a good while. The whole emphasis is that we're all sent ones. We're all sent. We gather to worship God, to hear a word from Him, get our lives right with Him, to confess our sins, to hear the gospel again, you're forgiven, to be directed. But then we gather to go to represent Him wherever He puts us. I mean, most of God's people are not doing what I do as a pastor. Most of God's people, I mean, pastor is taken captive. That Ephesians 4 thing, there are some of you that have been taken captive to actually do what most of my people I've called them to do, to equip God's people for the works of ministry that they go. So everything you're talking about, just, you know, that whole matter of marketplace ministries has to be central. However, you're right. It just seems like that has been a very hard thing. The courage to identify yourself as belonging to Jesus in the marketplace. The belief that even if you have been unemployed, that you represent him on the unemployment line. And to see yourself wherever you go as being sent is something that needs to be, it seems to me, it needs to be a part of the Christian mantra of your church. You gather to go. So that I almost always say, we have gathered here to worship, but the real lives of worship begin now. As we leave this, and we're going to need some help, aren't we? I always say we're going to face some of those same temptations, and we're going to face some of the same battles and struggles, but we are going as his representatives. I think that we have to, the sort of Rambo notion of the pastor or Christian worker, as we're going to get everybody to come in and hear him or see him do the battle, just isn't the way that God ever intended for it to be. So right now, I do see this happening. I'm still not, I mean, it's far from what it should be, but we run a program called Alpha. It's come out of Great Britain, training people to do this. It's a place where people can bring other people to do. But mostly we are trying to get people to take Alpha out into their workplaces. So we have Alpha in Disney. We have Alpha going on in Warner from our people who are working there, trying to find a practical way that they can get out of that fear barrier to actually communicate the gospel in the workplace. So all I can say is I resonate so deeply with everything that you have said, and we're far from where it should be. But that's where I think we, as pastors, have to realize our main calling is to equip people to go out into the workplace. There was an old man named Pete Hammond, started with a group called InterVarsity, Marketplace Ministries. And I think he had an illustration that he divided between the lizards and the frogs. He said, pastors are more like the frogs. You can usually keep them out of the house. But lizards, you can't keep them out of anywhere. And he says, your people are your lizards. So they're going into the workplaces, they're working in different homes, they're going into all sorts of places. They have to be the ones who are equipped and representing Christ and carrying the gospel. So I've got to feel that. It takes away some of that pastor's messianic complex that I have to do it all or it's not going to get done. It takes away some of the pastor's pride that the effective ministry of your life is going to be through what happens in your people's lives and through them.
I think part of this, too, is a theological embracing of the concept of the priesthood of all believers. I remember seeing a sign in a church, I don't remember where it was now, drove by and I did a double take and went back and looked at it. And when it said minister, it said the congregation. Yeah. That theoretically, what they were trying to communicate there is that the real job of the ministry was to equip the people to become the ministry, to go into, and they were into, I assume, the marketplace, workplace, witness kinds of strategies. And that's what we're trying to do with Office of Faith, Work, and Economics across several institutions. It's a movement now that exists in 25 or 30 schools across the country to really help those who are in religious leadership understand that their job is to equip the laity for the work of the ministry. But I think because of our hierarchical systems, particularly in systems like Methodism, within Catholicism, where there's such a hierarchy, that there's a tendency for lay people to defer to, and for then the hierarchy to reinforce that deferring to the work of the ministry to those that are officially trained. And that's another aspect, and of course you can speak to this.
Can I add one?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's so little systematic equipping of laity. So the Lay Mobilization Institute that Bryan heads up here is really an attempt to reawaken in the church this idea that it's the laity that do the ministry, and most of that ministry happens for them in their assigned workplace or in their assigned home. So,
Yeah. A conviction that I've had again and again since I've been a pastor, though, is even though I really believe this, my main role, as Ephesians 4 makes so clear, is to equip people to go out and represent Christ. I feel this deep conviction that I have to keep doing it.
yeah.
Because it's so easy for me. I like to study. I like to prepare sermons. I feel the necessity of meeting with my staff. We have a fairly large staff. I feel deep responsibility to invest, especially right now in younger pastors, because I'm getting to be this old. So all of that, and I'll tell you, that can take all of my time. And then I'm failing actually to be one of those who goes out and enters into those difficult places and struggles with the way people. So I have to intentionally look for places. I have to just force myself to get out of my seat and to actually. So I think our main task is that, or else it becomes all centered around us. On the other side, I think if I, as a pastor, I'm not actually doing what I'm calling my people to do, there's just something that feels kind of hypocritical to me about that. And it makes it also so that I feel like my preaching becomes increasingly heady rather than really engaging with either the needs of the world to bring the gospel over my own church people and how hard it is to live in the light of the gospel. So I had to add that because it's just a conviction I feel over and over again. The Lord saying to me, Greg, you've got to do what you're calling your people to do, or it's going to be empty.
Yeah, it's really critical. One of the ways when we're engaging in these kinds of conversations in local churches, it's a very different. You put a group of pastors in the room, have a conversation about how could we engage in marketplace ministry. I mean, I was talking to some friends earlier today. It's like putting a bunch of old white men in the room to talk about how to figure out poverty in your community. It's the wrong people to ask. Get the marketplace people who already live there. And so one of the dynamics is that people don't feel equipped. They may already be in the places of influence, but they don't feel equipped. And so one of the things that we want to see developing is what turns into, in a team environment, sort of a co-mentoring, where pastors are able to disciple, to encourage, to equip, to empower, but where lay people are able then to speak to the kind of strategy it's going to take to actually make the gospel effective in the places where they already live and serve. And so that's why more of a systematic kind of approach to this, where first and foremost, we're being disciples ourselves. But that if we're truly disciples, we've got to become disciple makers. And so what does that look like in the marketplace? But instead of learning that piece from the clergy, which doesn't make any sense at all, learning that piece instead from the people who already live and work and breathe in the marketplace. There are folks that have actually kind of prophetically spoke that the marketplace is the church's next big revival. That average, ordinary lay people, as sent ambassadors of Christ. You didn't get quite that far in 2 Corinthians 5 today, but we've been given the same ministry of reconciliation that Christ has, and that we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as if God is making his appeal to the world through us, because of course he is. And who is he making that appeal through? Well, certainly, if we're pastors, we get an opportunity to be a part of that, and we have to model the way. But the most effective mission work, the most effective engaging culture, is going to come from people who already know that culture, already live there. And yet, we've got to be able to equip them to be able to do that. And so, involving people in the conversation of what is it going to take to engage our culture in that kind of way. And what I found fascinating, I had an opportunity a few years ago to develop an incubator of sorts that was full of business leaders who were all Christian. There weren't any clergy in the room. It's all business people with the thought of how would we reach the city of Lexington with the gospel of Jesus. You know what? It was a very different conversation than it would have been with a set of pastors. Very different. It doesn't have anything to do with getting people into the walls of the church building. They start imagining, could my insurance company actually be a place where the gospel thrives? could we plant a community of faith like right here in this business? Why not? I mean, what would keep us from that? And beginning to think about that in that kind of way, that it's their context. So dreaming of that, but equipping people to the point as disciples, they would even imagine those kinds of things, and then helping them actually live into that, the courage to take the gospel into those places. So anyway, we often use the language when we're having these conversations in local churches to begin to shift the way we think about things from our seating capacity to our sending capacity. That we are a sent people. We gather to worship, and this is important for us, but the real ministry happens out there. It happens in our homes, it happens in our neighborhoods, it happens in the marketplace, in our businesses, in the schools, wherever. And so I can't even tell you, I met with a Methodist pastor this week, and she told me a story. She's like, I wish this had been my idea, but I never would have thought of it, you know. And so she's got 2 lay people in her church that just began to engage in conversation with the school. They started volunteering with the local elementary school, and the principal came to them and asked if the church would start doing ministry in the school. Well, the pastor's going, I didn't think that was even legal. I never would have even thought of this. But these lay people are like, well, it's where our kids go to school. Of all the places the gospel needs to be, it's right here. And so, but it was actually lay people feeling equipped enough, but they then are in the places of influence and to set people free to be empowered to lead in those places. So
one more quick comment. I mentioned that one of our fastest growing concentrations here at Asbury Seminary is church planting. And what we're discovering is that the church planting orientation means that more and more of these people are wanting to be bivocational. They don't want to be dependent upon the congregation for their support. And so we're seeing a lot of very creative bivocational church planting modalities developing. One of the most recent was the starting of a coffee shop that then they actually work the coffee shop during the week, and then on Sundays they actually open the coffee shop up, push the chairs around, and then they gather in people off the street, people that have been their customers. And so I think we're going to see a significant increase in this idea of bivocational ministries, which then means contingent upon us as a seminary to be much more effective in helping develop a theology of faith-work integration, and how that then gets translated out into other lay people who can then begin to see they may not start a coffee shop, but they are actually church planting in a very real way within their workplace.
Well, and it's one final comment I would say on this is that even from a theological perspective, even looking biblically, work is part of our worship.
Yeah.
It's not just what we do to make a living, but it actually is part of our life of worship. And so redeeming that, that when folks go to work, they actually see it as an offering to God, but also as an opportunity to be a witness. So
Work as unto the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Even a slave.
A couple other comments before we finish today.
I know you asked for an easy question a moment ago, so we got an easy one. Just looking for a number or a metric. I know at least 2 of you had mentioned pastoring larger congregations, and yet feeling the tug and pull to invest in staff, also to be out doing ministry like you call your people to. So I'm just wondering, in a preaching context here, how much time do we set aside for this craft of preaching as we have other necessities too? And does it get harder in a larger congregation, or is it easier because you don't have to be the jack of all trades or something along those lines?
Yeah.
So thank you.
That's yours, Bryan, my brother. You're the active pastor.
Because I started, the first church I pastored as a senior pastor only had about 115 people to start. So I remember that, where I would prepare a sermon for Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, the funerals, all the things that are happening. And now I get to be in this church that has all this pastoral staff. Which one is harder? I'm telling you, the preaching task was harder with the smaller church. There's just no doubt about it. All of you, I mean, don't you start feeling like you're turning into a preaching machine of some sort? You've just got to get you almost feel like you never have any time to do anything creative because you've just got to be able to have sort of a form to do that. Now, in the larger church, there are other things that are really hard about a larger church. but the opportunity to set aside more time for the preparation of messages is one of those things I've been very, very thankful for. But I don't know my son is an artist. He's also a musician, so I brought him back. In Southern California, you have this huge music community, and so I said, when the Spirit of God is at work, Wesleyans know this for sure, it's almost always that music comes. When the Spirit of God is really alive among us, that's when the greatest music of the church has always come forth. And so I said, I think God's at work here. We need to write some music. Were you there when so we put together a songwriter's workshop. So I was working on the 4 songs in the Gospel of Luke. I thought this would be good things. You can take those 4 things, kind of songs that are in the Gospel of Luke, and let's create some songs, new songs out of our congregation for it. So I brought my son in, knowing his church did this in Evanston, Illinois. He led us in this thing. And it was the craziest thing that he did. He said, okay, he assigned people to be in collaborative groups. So we had an African woman with a 70s or 80s rocker guy who's come to Jesus. They were going to write a song together. And so I went over what the text said briefly, and then he assigned them the text that they were going to write a song from, and he assigned them the group, the people they were going to write it with. And Brian, you probably write songs, don't you? He said, I'll give you 30 minutes to come back with the seed of a song. I said, 30 minutes? These people don't even know one another. But they went back, and in about 10 minutes, I heard nothing. 15 minutes, I started hearing music come out of every one of these 12 rooms I was walking around. And every one of them came back with a song, and now we put a number of them on a recording. I should have brought it with me here to let you hear it. That was done. I asked him about that, and he said it was a study that he'd seen, that when you bring people together and they are really forced to concentrate on a task together, they get the product done and it's better. Sometimes I've wondered if that might be true of preaching. I have more time to prepare now, but I wonder if I didn't preach better before I had that. I'm not sure. You'll have to ask my people. All that is to say, I do set aside times. I can take away, I usually take 2 weeks away simply to prepare the whole sermon series that we're going to be going over. So I lay it out, because our people who do all the visuals and our people who put the music together and the people who do videos, they all want to know where we're going. Sometimes the Spirit of God breaks in, actually, and I say, oh, Spirit of God, you want to say something at church? Can I give you 3 minutes, 6 weeks from now? Sometimes I have to throw it all out, because I think I know this is what I scheduled, but this is what's happening in our world, and we need to hear a word from God about this, and that throws our people off a lot. But in general, I feel like probably 30 to 40% of my time is spent in sermon prep. I don't do it alone. Some of you may know that. I told some of the Salvation Army people.
Yeah, share that, Greg, because I think that's really important.
You already heard me sort of get at it. Now I've gotten to be an old guy. How do I understand? This world is different. How do I understand the issues and illustrations that might connect with the 20-something generation? We have this huge Chinese community. How do I understand what on earth this message will say to them? And so on Tuesday afternoons, I do sermon preparation in collaboration with a group of younger pastors from a variety of ethnicities. A lot of them are Fuller interns, because Fuller Seminary is right across the street from my church. So I went into it thinking, here I am, a PhD in New Testament, a long time seasoned pastor. I was a seminary president, so I'm going to mentor these people. I'm telling you, it's gone the other way. Yeah. There are things that I'm not going to be falsely humble in this sense to say I have nothing to offer them. That's not true. I've walked with the Lord a long time. So there's a whole lot in the working with scriptures and so forth that I have to say. But I'm telling you, in so much of the preaching task, I just sometimes feel like I've gained more than I have given. It certainly has stretched me. So all of that is to say that that helps me, finding sermon illustration material, application of issues. So I take about it often becomes 2.5 hours every Tuesday afternoon too, just to work on Bible texts together with other people. it's been really enriching for my life as a pastor.
And I'll just say something real quickly about this. Some of you know George Acevedo down in Cape Coral, Florida, and Grace United Methodist Church down there. But they've gone to a model where they have a teaching team, some of which are clergy, some of which are laity. And but what that in essence means is that they write their sermon together. They come up with, they go away, get kind of big picture, kind of here's themes, but then they write an outline together at the beginning of the week, and then there's one primary writer for the rest of the sermon, and then they all put their own illustrations into it by the end of the week. And what it's done is it's enabled them to spend far less time and preach more effectively because they're collaborating together. And one of the fascinating, obviously, that's a bigger church, and so if you're not serving a bigger church, that can just sound discouraging. But one of the fascinating things I've seen happen is pastors are often in covenant groups with one another, like in different contexts. And for instance, there's a set of Methodist pastors over in Louisville that meet together to write sermons. And now they're doing some accountability with one another as well, but they're actually writing sermons collaboratively, not unlike what you just described. And what they're finding is, because what their congregations need from them is not just good sermons, but also a lot of other leadership also, and particularly discipling people, they're given more time to actually be in groups with people because they're spending less time working on their sermons because they're doing it collaboratively with a few others. Yeah. And so, and what they've articulated is that they're actually preaching better now than they used to, and they're spending less time on it because they've asked for help, and they're doing it with others. And so it's just an idea, but it's working for them, and it's similar to what Greg just described. So.
One other conviction that I have, that I don't know if you'll agree with me on this. So sometimes when we'd have our high school or junior high pastor, they would call me and say, Greg, can we bring one of our students in? Or one of our business people in? And I said, of course. My conviction is when we receive Jesus as Savior, God gives His Holy, this is a theological point. When does the Holy Spirit come? But I believe that God gives to us His Spirit. So when I meet with my people, we open up the Word of our Father, all of us indwelt by the Spirit, and even though I can try to help us see, because of my years of study, where you fall outside of what this text is really saying, I am telling you, our junior hires, our senior hires, our people who, they have contributions to understanding this text and applying this text that I would never have imagined. So if you have that sense to say, even though I've been called to be the one who delivers the word to our people, but my people, when I study our Father's word together with my people, the Spirit of God is going to have something to say through them, to me, and then through to people. So that's a conviction that's really changed a lot of my own approach to that.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. And so I think the mic is already back here with somebody, and then obviously if there are other things that we can interact with even after we're done today, we'd be glad to.
This has been a fascinating conversation, especially in light of the last few comments that have been made. I'm curious, we do tend to think about preaching as monologue with a speaker and listeners. I'm curious, in light of the conversations here about culture and being relational and engaging, any thoughts about how we might be more dialogical even in our preaching, as opposed to just kind of the talking head and the listeners? Any thoughts there?
Well, there are a couple of things I want to say. I don't necessarily think about that, preaching that way, but I practice it often that way in light of, I have a 5,000-seat sanctuary, so dialogical preaching really becomes very, very hard there. On the other side, when I think about, even if it is mostly a one-way kind of communication, even then it is not fully that. My experience, and preachers who are here, I don't know if this is yours, my experience of preaching over the years is I work hard to understand what our Father has to say. I feel bound by it. I am there to be faithful to this word. My biggest prayer is that I will be that. So I work hard on the text to try to understand it. So I have a relationship to that text when I do that. I also have a relationship to my people. I need to know them, the cultural issues that are there, the things, and so I prepare to have a message that I will bring to them. But when I actually go into the pulpit, the dynamic that I sense as I do this is not that I just bring what I have written, even though I write out my messages, but so many times when I am preaching, I will look out and see my people, and I think, this is the way that I wrote it to be said, but this is not connecting. And so you get that sense. I mean, sometimes it's just a feeling, but you've got to go with this thing. Moreover, I really sense the presence of the Spirit of God as I open this Word of God. And I sometimes have, and it's sometimes hard for me to sort it out. This is what I have prepared to preach to my people. But in the midst of that message, and I've got to look around, in the midst of that message, I even sense God saying to me, this is what you had planned, but I think you need to deliver this. Now, it's really hard sometimes to sort that out. Sometimes is it that I just didn't get a good night's sleep? Is it an undigested piece of beef that this thought comes popping into my head that I throw in? But I've just decided over the years, if I don't go with what I think is the leading of God's Spirit, how do I know how to walk with God? So I just try to take that. So for me, the preaching task is always for me personally, a very alive and dynamic enterprise. Now, of course, it is most fun for me to go in and preach in black churches. At Trinity, where I used to be president, we had a larger African-American population than I see here at Asbury. I'm not sure that's true, but my eyes tell me that that's probably true. And so I would often get called to preach at our students' churches or our alums' churches. And that was where I learned a different kind of dialogical preaching. It wasn't people answering and responding and things, but I'm telling you, they were keeping you in line. And guiding you. So one time I was preaching from Micah 6:8, and I said, we are to love mercy because God loves mercy. How much does God love mercy? And as I was going with this, somebody in the back row said, you've got to slow down here. We're not with you yet. They yelled that out from the back of the church. You've got to slow down here. So I slowed down there. And I started doing as I'm doing now. I started telling the stories. And then I think it was one of the younger men on the other side over there looked and said, we have it now bring us home. So I think he wanted the sermon to get over with. But all of that is to say that even though it is mostly a monologue in a church like ours, I don't think of preaching that way. But I do think that people who are more gifted than I am within certain kinds of settings could actually do more dialogical kind of preaching with your people where you can hear from them and then respond to them. But that's
yeah, I think the traditional model we have obviously doesn't allow for immediate dialogical, but I think one of the things, you have a Facebook page, and I noticed often that our people are commenting on something in the message that really spoke to them. One of the disadvantages of email.
They disagreed about.
They disagreed about, on occasion you see that. Or the ability to invite people, give people permission to give you feedback. Did this click? Did this work? One of the things I appreciated about Greg is often he would say in our conversations, if I would comment on a message, he would say, well, did that work? Or could I have said that differently? And I think, so it's a post-dialogical aspect. But again, coming to the pre-dialogical with this idea of collaborative and particularly having members of your congregation, if you don't have a staff, that you could meet with periodically to say, I'm doing this, I'm marching through Mark, and what is missing? Is there, what would you want more clarification on? So opening up the opportunity for people to feedback to you prior to and afterwards, I think is very, very helpful. There have been a couple of settings, and I'm not sure I would be open to it personally. We now have electronic devices that you can, give to the people, and they can respond accordingly, in terms of whether or not they're getting this point or not getting this point. Yeah, running Twitter feed. And if it's tied to some kind of electronic shock system, in the pulpit, it really can promote a sensitivity to dialogue that would be. But anyway, for what it's worth, why don't you wrap us up?
Well, the only thing else I would speak to this in particular, obviously, and we've kind of already hit on this, if the sermon, we have the assumption that a monologue kind of sermon, even with the kind of dialogical pre and post stuff, is our only strategy for discipling people, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
If it's coupled with others, especially getting people into a dynamic, interactive conversation where they're being spiritually formed together, then that can be really powerful. There are a number of church plants out there, fresh expressions kinds of things, that are actually experimenting with more of a dialogue kind of approach to digging into the Scripture together as a part of their weekly rhythm, what would be a traditional service in a lot of other places, and getting real fruit out of that. One of the dangers is to completely eliminate the Word of God entirely from those kind of conversations. So unfortunately, and this gets back to the same kind of thing, it may not be drinking beer with the people you're trying to reach, but if in conversation and we're in the midst of something where people need to be discipled and we're only sharing about life together and we're not actually ever looking at the Word of God, then we're in trouble. But there are multiple ways to have a conversation about the Scripture. Preaching in a big crowd of people is one of those, but having dialogue and interaction around things, there are a lot of churches that have gone to, even using more of a monologue kind of sermon, to having small groups and other kind of opportunities that are specifically tied to whatever's preached. And so people get an opportunity to interact with it. And even just adult learning theory teaches us that people only retain about 15% of what they hear. But if they get to interact with it, it goes up to like 90% if it actually has application. So one of the things John Wesley was prone to saying to his lay preachers, no sermonizing. In other words, if there is no practical application to whatever you're preaching about, you don't get to preach. This was John Wesley's stance on this, is to say people have to know what they need to do with what they're hearing. And so how are they going to react to that? Could be that they get an opportunity to respond. Could be that they get an opportunity to have conversation about it. There are a lot of ways to get at that. But to flip that statistic on its head, where people are not just hearing the Word, but they're actually embodying it, we got to have a chance to play with it, to interact with it, to have conversation about it. So the Word's got to be central for us. But there are a lot of ways to deliver it. And so we're out of time today. And so it has been, thank you. It's been our delight to have these conversations with you. And so if there are other questions, just really pressing, a couple of us can stick around for a few minutes afterward. But I think Andrea's got a couple announcements for us about the rest of the day.